Hello everyone, I'm Sam and I work as part of Nationwide's dedicated ways of working team. And with the time that I've got with you today, essentially I'm going to be giving you a short introduction into how we're looking to evolve ways of working within Nationwide and how we're demystifying business agility for the teams that we work with. And then finally we'll wrap up by just touching on some of our key levers for success that we rely on. So I'm going to jump straight into it. First of all, the thing that I'm going to talk about is concept. So concept is something that you will all be familiar with. It's hard to avoid. It's everywhere, from agile principles, practices, methods, to flow, to design thinking, to lean manufacturing. There is really an abundance of insight available to us through communities and events such as this, and at the click of a finger. The need to shift the way we work is, I would say, widely understood and even accepted, at least in principle. But there are certainly different layers of understanding when it comes to the concept and the things that we're aiming for with the teams that we work with. We tend to engage with the things that are really interesting to us, and we make time for those things, and everything else we wait until we have to engage with it. And then over here on the right hand side we have context, and what I'm talking about here is essentially the way teams work today, their flow of work and how work gets delivered. In addition to that, you've got the level of investment available to make changes to the way teams work. On top of that, you've got the buy-in and the leadership support. You've got the current skills and capabilities that are in place, and also the priorities and challenges that teams face. It's essentially going to look very different depending on the team that you engage with, even within the same organisation. What I often find is this results in confusion, and that's not to say that teams are confused about agile ways of working, just how that concept translates with them within their context. And some key indicators for that are things that I'm sure are familiar to people, but when you hear things like, how do we become agile? How do we implement agile? What frameworks do we need to use? What tools do we need to use? Can you give me the answer? Show me how it's done. All those sorts of things that are kind of indicators that teams need a bit of support. It might be that people are saying agile doesn't work for them, or they've tried it and it hasn't quite worked out. What teams are looking for is clarity, and that's ultimately, again, how the concept translates within their context. Because the challenges that teams face when adopting, embedding and scaling agile ways of working are contextual, right? There certainly isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. And that's something that we bear in mind when we're engaging with teams. So let's look a little bit closer into that in a different view. I'm going to share with you some examples that I've come across in recent years at Nationwide that I'm confident actually that people listening to this will be super familiar with. So first of all, we have a team here who are a product development Scrum team who fully embrace agile ways of working, but feel held back by their organisation. Within their bubble, it's fine. They've got all the working practices in place, but they feel disempowered to break down those silos that result in handoffs and increased wait times. They don't feel like they have the leadership support or the autonomy to make those changes. So every time they need to reach outside of their immediate ecosystem, they get stuck. So conceptually, they've got it down, but unfortunately they're trapped by their context whenever they reach out. Coming on to the next team, in this example, we've got a team that write database programs, and they require detailed business requirements and solution designs before they start work. because otherwise, how do they give accurate estimates? How do they get funding? They are very much embedded with their current working practices and don't see a way of shifting to new ways of working. Conceptually, they probably haven't had time to explore things that they can do to change up the way they work. And there is a clue there on the expectations on them. If they're expected to provide accurate estimates up front, that is going to drive the working practices that they adopt, because that's the context that they're working in. And next, we have a team that have been told, you need to change. We're going to do this agile thing. And, the appetite is there. The skills and capabilities are there and everybody's raring to go. But unfortunately, they're tied down because they're midway through a strategic program, a 3-year strategic program that has a lot riding on it, and it's already behind plan. So this team, as much as they'd love to adopt the ways of working, they're trapped, again, by their context because they just don't have the time. And then finally, let's look at another team, a Scrum team who work as part of a wider value stream that have adopted SAFe. Again, for this team, all working practices, roles, frameworks, capabilities, etc. are in place. There is a well-trodden delivery path for this team. They're delivering incrementally and they've got a regular feedback loop in place, and they're very much connected to their customers, which sounds fantastic. But unfortunately, skimming under the surface, the people within those teams don't have the autonomy to make design decisions. They don't get involved in the prioritization of work, and technical debt is building up. They're essentially building on sand. So when you look at it from that perspective, it sounds horrible. But this team are actually only a hop, skip and a jump away from true optimization. For this team, it's a cultural shift. What we need here is the management layer to trust the people that they've recruited for their talents and expertise, and listen to them and be willing to accept their advice and slow down to speed up. So they're on the cusp of something really quite great. What this does is it really reiterates that there is no one-size-fits-all approach. The interventions with each of these different teams would look and feel very different because there are different needs. And if we try to sit over here and define how the organisation was going to change the ways of work from a one-size-fits-all perspective, in practice, that's not going to work very well. We need to really get into the team's context to be able to help them. And there's a few things that we as enablement folk value that assists us with that. The first being partnership. So we very much partner with the teams, the business areas, the communities, the missions that we work with to adopt and further develop current ways of working in a bid to increase agility from the ground up by forming contextual ways of working enablement teams, which is something that we're going to come on to. Measurement is something that we value. We define our desired outcomes, keeping internal customers at the heart of what we're doing. We co-create these with the teams that we're working with. We also value data. So data provides us with an objective view of where we need to focus our attention and identify what our biggest impediments to flow and business agility are, rather than opinion. And finally, we define small and controlled experiments that we believe will resolve those impediments, and then we share our findings transparently with the rest of the organisation, regardless of result, regardless of whether it's successful or not. There is still very much learning to be had there. So that's a very brief intro, but I'm going to dive deeper still and talk a little bit about the different dimensions within the ways of working team at Nationwide. And first of all, I'm going to start with our Accelerator products. So our Accelerator products, their primary focus is to essentially accelerate the resolution of systemic impediments to flow and business agility. Accelerator products are an emergent capability, so the size of each of these teams will flex depending on the needs at the time and the appetite and ambitions of each accelerator product. If the demand for these products diminishes, then essentially these accelerators will disband. And new accelerators can also be spun up based on kind of an aggregated view of impediments across all the teams that the ways of working team are engaged with. At the moment, we've got 4 fundamental accelerators that are on the pitch with us at the moment, and the first of those being our DevOps accelerator. So our DevOps accelerator team partners with ways of working enablement teams to accelerate DevOps adoption within nationwide by incorporating best practices from site reliability engineering, providing education and support, and facilitating increased automation. We've then got our intelligent flow accelerator, who work with our finance functions that look to shift the focus to funding outcomes and long-lived teams, and by making strategic investment decisions based on a prioritised list of work. We've then got our intelligent controls accelerator, who are essentially transforming the way our governance functions operate with a minimum viable controls approach, bringing controls into the work by design and promoting continuous and early engagement via safety teams. And then finally, we have our measurement and insight accelerator, who are building us a product that allows us to make our metrics insights visible across the organisation and really draw focus and attention to the things that matter, so we can prioritise our continuous improvement efforts and optimise our workflow. So you can start to see how all of these different accelerator products really do complement the ways of working that we're trying to encourage. Another facet of our offering that I've touched on very briefly is our ways of working enablement teams, or what we call WOWETs. So our WOWETs are led by our squads, communities and missions within nationwide, with a primary focus on surfacing and prioritising continuous improvement experiments, which will result in patterns of success that can be shared more widely across the organisation. And patterns is something that I'll come on to in just a second. Supporting those are our enablement specialists. Our enablement specialists are dedicated employees who represent the ways of working team, and they bring with them the capability that is needed to support and really work in partnership with the ways of working enablement teams, enabling them to get up and running. They will create new WOWETs and they will contract with them and support the continuous improvement effort. Along with our accelerators, WOWETs and enablement specialists, we also host several self-serve channels within the ways of working enablement team. This allows colleagues from across the organisation to have access to the insights that are available, the work that we're doing, so it's completely transparent, and all the activity ongoing with WOWETs and accelerators. And the emphasis here is on teams being able to make small incremental changes within their context, within their areas, without having to wait for dedicated interventions as part of this team. The WOW team, just like any other team, has a finite amount of resource, and we really need to prioritise our efforts based on business need and appetite, so we can't satisfy every team across the organisation at any one time. So it is really important that other people can access and have sight of what we're doing. I've touched very briefly on patterns, and what we mean by patterns here is when we've got experiments that have come into fruition and we've got something worthy of sharing that the rest of the organisation can benefit from, we will curate, and we have curated patterns. And patterns not only give a step-by-step guide on how teams can essentially rinse and repeat some of the work that we've done, but it also goes a level deeper and includes things like the challenges faced, the investment needed, the time taken, any cultural impediments that were faced and how those were resolved. So it's really quite comprehensive. And this very much allows us to increase the amount of value that we can offer by making those things available. And then also important to mention is our partnerships. So we have some deliberated and targeted partnerships with a number of areas across the organisation. For example, our people and culture community, our communities of excellence, and our value realisation office. All of the areas in which we have partnerships have very much a shared agenda, in that there is an aspiration to improve the flow of work and bring value to our members sooner and safely, but we're applying slightly different lenses. We talked at the start about that confusion space, and what we don't want to do is add to that confusion. So alignment is really, really important to make sure that we have a shared message. And what this does is then gives us a much more expansive platform in which to propagate the things that we're learning and experimenting with, coming at it from different angles and from different audiences. So our reach is much, much broader. And then finally, what you'll see on this slide, and all of what I shared so far, is very much underpinned by BVSSH, better, value, sooner, safer, happier. This is something that essentially frames the work that we do from a measurement perspective and gives us some really sensible and appropriate and aspirational goals and aims and things that we can measure ourselves against. And if you haven't heard of BVSSH, then no doubt after this conference you will have, because I know John Smart will be giving a talk. And I'm also led to believe that you'll be able to read all about it by the time this goes out, with the book being released on the 10th of November. So definitely a recommended read there. But that's essentially what makes up the team in a snapshot view. So I realise that's quite a lot of information, and there is just kind of one other element to touch on here, which is a little bit about how we operate and how we bring that to life, and what's our internal pattern within the ways of working team. So for us, everything starts with visualisation. So visualising the flow of work using objective data where we can. It's really, really important for us to get a baseline so we understand and we can see how things are trending and the improvements that we've made. And without a baseline, you can't necessarily do that. And what we've found is actually establishing that baseline in the first instance has been the first challenge that we've had to face, getting that clean data view on our workflow and understanding the flow of work end to end. Then what we'll look to do once we've got that view and we can start to focus in on the things that are really impeding that flow of work and impeding us from optimising the way that we work, we will then come up with a number of hypotheses on how we can resolve those. Naturally, there will be several and they will need to be prioritised. And once that's done, we can form experiments on how we're going to resolve those impediments. When we've defined those, we will also define and co-create with the ways of working enablement teams that we're partnered with a set of OKRs. So we can have defined targets and leading and lagging indicators. So we are really aligned in what the thing is that we're trying to achieve. What is the outcome that we're driving towards? And how do we keep ourselves honest? Throughout all of this, we will continue to measure ourselves and see what our indicators are telling us to make sure that we remain on track for the outcomes we're trying to achieve, but also so that we can change what we're doing and pivot if what we were expecting to see isn't a reality. And then finally, we will circle back round and look at the experiment holistically to see what we've learned, what's worth sharing, and how we can adjust ourselves going forward before repeating that cycle again, and continuing to do that until we've got a really optimised workflow. There can be several of these experiments going on at any one time across multiple teams, so there really is quite a lot of activity. And one thing that we need to bear in mind, and that we've certainly learnt ourselves, is the importance of managing our own work in progress and not biting off more than we can chew. And having those OKRs in place, those co-created OKRs, really help us to do that, because we can focus on what it is that we're trying to do, what we're trying to achieve. Layered into those are some really important considerations for us as enablement folk. As I've said before, we very much partner with the missions communities and squads that we're working with. And we only go where there is A, a business need, and B, an appetite. We very much need to be knocking on an open door when it comes to this type of work. So we will go where teams are ready for us. As I've said before, understanding the context is really key, and establishing a baseline. We will posture the way that we work with teams depending on the context of that particular team and the needs at the time. And we will take a very much tailored approach. Coaching at all levels is also extremely important, to seek to understand the resistance within teams without judgment and work to resolve those things. And continuous contracting. So we've talked a little bit about OKRs, but actually contracting on how we operate together in partnership is really, really important, so we can all remain aligned. And then finally, context. Context, again, I've talked about a lot. It's really, really important to move from that space of confusion into clarity and apply a lens that's fit for purpose for each individual team. So that's essentially our mechanism, if you will, our main go-to pattern within the ways of working team. Okay, and so finally, to wrap up then, what we're not here to do today is to claim that Nationwide have the golden ticket to wider adoption of agile ways of working. Purely what we believe will work for us within our context today. Tomorrow it may change, and actually we're okay with that, because we're constantly evolving and learning new things. So what I'll leave you with here today is just a couple of reflections that we've had in terms of what's important for us to remember and keep in the back of our minds as we're going through this.
Thank you very much, Sam. Hello, everyone. My name is Ellie Taylor, and I'm also an enablement specialist at Nationwide Building Society. I've been in this role for nearly a year now. Prior to that, I led our internal audit community to adopt and adapt new ways of working. As you'll know, there's lots of tools and techniques associated with new ways of working, and most of them have their roots in IT. But I'm particularly passionate about building business agility across organisations, because I've seen that it's not just for change in IT. Although we never approached it as a transformation in audit, by using some of those tools and techniques, we achieved a fabulous transformation of our community, including changing people's mindsets, which was our ultimate goal. And so I'm really keen to bring all those lessons we learned during that time to the rest of Nationwide and beyond, if possible. So today I'm now going to move into starting to unpack some of the principles that Sam's already shared with you and how we're practically applying them. I'm not going to go through all of them because that would just take far too long. But it's really important to note that there's no hierarchy to the principles. They are all as important to each other for us. But having said that, it's probably fair to say that some of those principles are more at the forefront of our minds at different stages of the journey. And today, I'm going to focus on 4 of the principles that we found to be particularly useful when we start to engage and support areas and teams across the organisation. So where to start? Well, before we actually start, we try to hold ourselves true to the invite over inflict principle that we have. And by that, we mean that it's really important that we don't inflict our change on others, that we actually invite them to the table and they want to change. And we only choose to engage with teams who are change ready. And by change ready, we mean that there is both an appetite to change, and also there's an openness to change. And both of those things are really important. And sometimes we will get teams that come along to us and they have a real appetite to have a go at new ways of working. But in terms of their openness to trying new things, they're not quite in that space yet. So we may need to do some more selling of the benefits and work with them before we can start them along that journey. So how we do that is by having a discussion up front. We set out our terms of engagement, and in that we set out some really clear goals on both sides of the partnership, and we commit to the teams that we are working with, they commit to being trained and coached in new ways of working. Once we have engaged with those teams, we then start to think about the leaders of those teams, because we know from experience that starting with leaders is critical to the success. And if leaders are not behind this, it just simply won't work. It really is as simple as that. You need to get the leadership on board. We want our leaders to be role models for their teams and for the rest of the organisation. Because it's a simple rule of thumb that if leaders are doing something, then their teams are more likely to give something a go to. There's something about that safety that builds. And it also follows on the other side of that scale, that if leaders don't change the way they behave or embrace some new tools and techniques or some of that mindset shift and some of those behaviours, their own teams are less likely to stick to trying something new. It can't be underestimated how hard this can be, though. Leaders have been really successful in their careers so far, and that's why they're in the position they're in. So they know that the way that they've been doing things in the past has worked for them to this point. And very often I'll hear something along the lines of, well, yes, it's for our teams, but it's not for us. I don't need to change, do I? But it's really important that they do change, because you can only get so far if you change the mindset of everyone, including the leaders and the teams and the ways of working at a team level, because otherwise that team will always bump into the way that their leaders are working. And also, if leaders don't embrace the way that they're working, then they don't know what it feels like to work in a different way. And also they don't know, and that means they don't know how difficult it is for people to change, because it is quite hard to change your mindset and to change your behaviours. So I like to think of it as a simple equation. If leaders give it a go, then they'll know how it feels. And when they know how it feels and they're giving it a go, that means that they're creating a safe space for their teams to have a go to. And that means that their teams are more likely to imitate them and to give things a go. So the teams then give it a go. They imitate what their leaders are doing. They get some feedback. The leaders see how that's working. It's almost like a virtual circle, but without that role modeling at the top. I have seen lots of dissatisfaction from teams who've been really willing to give this a go, have embraced it, tried new tools and techniques, but they become very disheartened and actually quite resentful when they bump into the ways that their leaders continue to work, because they're not working in the same way. And it stops them from making the most of those new ways of working. And that resentment can then lead to an environment of poor psychological safety, which means that those experiments will fall, they'll drop away, and then we'll ultimately fall back into our old ways of working again. So that's why that principle is really important for us. In terms of the next principle that I like to think of when I'm starting to work with new teams, it's really important that we make sure we pay attention to the context that those teams are working in, how those teams are configured, what type of work they're doing. So, for example, the work that they're doing might be relatively known and simple and doesn't need any particular expertise, as the flow of the work is well documented. For example, call handling, where there's a playbook to help with different types of queries. Or it may be more specialised. The work is known, but there's a certain level of expertise that's needed to ensure the work continues to flow through the system properly. For example, that could be processing a mortgage that's already built from end to end. And sometimes our work is unknown. We don't know what the answer is yet, and we don't know what we don't know yet. And we need to experiment. We need to try out new things. We might need to engage with our members. so that what we need emerges over time. For example, that could be the development of a new type of mortgage for a particular sector or a particular type of member. And each of these types of ways of working, each of these flows, each of the different teams that work in this way, there are plenty of tools and techniques that we can apply from a different ways of working perspective to enhance the value that they can achieve. But they might not need the same thing. And to work out which is the right thing to do, we tend to use the Enablement model, which helps us to work out which type of technique we might want to use. And that model is very helpful, and I would encourage people to look at it when they are working with new teams as a first port of call for what actually do they need to help them. We're also keen, or I'm also keen, to watch my language when I work with new teams, because there is a language set that comes with new ways of working, but often it can be seen as a bit of jargon, and it can actually push the off button for people very, very quickly. So things like planning poker and epics, user stories, t-shirt sizing, those sorts of things for teams that are working in that way, they're fine, and they probably don't make anyone feel awkward because it's really familiar. But for some people, and particularly for some people from other parts of the business that sit around the leadership table, it's all brand new, and the new language can be just seen as jargon and really, really unhelpful. So I'm very careful about watching my language. And I learned that from my experience in audit, and I often draw on that experience when I'm engaging with new teams. And one thing that particularly comes to mind, I remember when I first started working with Scrum in internal audit, I went home and I told my husband about it, who's also an accountant. And the moment I got to the word ceremonies, he just started laughing out loud. And he said, well, good luck with that. With a room full of auditors, you'll never get that word past them. It just sounds like some sort of cult that you're implementing. And it's really a lesson I've never forgotten. And each time I engage with a new team, I remind myself that all the tools and techniques, they're a means to an end. And the words are helpful in the right context, but actually they can have the opposite effect when they're used at the wrong time and with the wrong people. But if you do adapt to that context, it will stick if it's right for that context. So those are the two things that I tend to look at when I'm looking at which is the key context for them. So the next principle, and this is probably the final principle that I will talk about today, and that is to focus on the right outcomes. So when we're starting with a new team, we need to be really clear about where they want to go and what is it that they want to achieve and how will the way that we work help them out. For us at Nationwide, that means that we are shifting from a focus on outputs to outcomes. It's very easy to identify the tasks that need to be completed, but we lose agility, we know, if we lock ourselves into what we're going to do and we define that upfront by the output. But also we lose sight of what it is we want to achieve as a result of our work. And it can take a bit of time, actually, to get people to think in that different way of thinking about outcomes rather than outputs. But it's absolutely worth the effort. And we also encourage our teams, when they're thinking about those outcomes, to move away from looking at our outcomes at the scale of a year or more, and we break our work down and focus on what we want to achieve in the next quarter and build our work up that way. And by doing that, it helps the teams to have a greater predictability of achieving those outcomes. So there's all the benefits of feeling like you're achieving in small chunks. That keeps people going. But also what it does is allow you to see whether yesterday's weather tells you that you're on the right track and whether you should keep going in that way or whether you need to make some adjustments. And you might need to make some adjustments to people, to some of the investment, or actually you might need to make some changes to the outcomes because what you believed at the beginning, actually that's not what's being delivered. And this is a really dynamic process, and that's very different to the ways that our teams have planned in the past. But what it does is allow us to keep checking back to enable us to predict forward. So that's a real benefit for us. And another key focus when we're looking at those outcomes is to help our teams to shift away from having too much work in progress, and having that big long list that they just start everything, and getting them to move towards limiting their work in progress so that they can actually achieve the outcomes that they want to. I'm sure you've all heard it before, by starting less, we finish more. To teams that are new to this, though, it sounds really counterintuitive, and it can be really difficult for them to shift because they've been told that for years doing lots of stuff is important. So not only are they focusing on output and doing lots of it, we want to shift them into focusing on outcomes, limiting their work in progress to make sure that they focus on the right things, they do them well, and they finish them before they start something new. And we're using this syntax here, which is helps them to focus on outcome-driven change. And many of you will have seen this before, I'm sure. So it goes along the lines of, I believe that this capability will result in this outcome. And really importantly, we'll know when we're successful when we see this measurable sign. And by using that syntax, that helps our teams and our teams that are new to this to think about things in a slightly different way, and it breaks it down into smaller chunks so that they can more easily and readily get to the place that they need to be. So they're the 4 principles that we focus on when we start with our new teams, and there's some, hopefully that's provided a bit of flavour behind some of those principles. Where next? Well, we'll continue to experiment as we go along our journey, and we'll identify things that work and things that don't work. And as a result of doing that, we are starting to build up a body of those successful practices and patterns so that we can then start to share those with the rest of the organisation. But as we share, we will be careful to ensure that we grow at a pace that's right for our teams and for our organisation. And inevitably, at times, we will need to slow down to speed up. But that's all part of the journey, and we're really comfortable with that, and we're helping our teams to become comfortable with that as well. So I'll finish there. Thank you very much for your time today. I hope you found the information Sam and I shared today really helpful, and we'd be delighted to take any questions you may have. And also, please don't hesitate to contact us directly. Thank you very much.